Welcome back, WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and Baltimore Positive. It is true. I've broken out the 2019 Chicken Palooza Rofo gear from it's green. I'm about to get like a real green screen behind me so everything doesn't flare, and then I can't wear anything green. So like I told everybody last week, Masters Week, had the Classic Five guys on and Ed Miller. I said, no more green for me. It's going to be all purple. It's going to be all orange moving forward. I want to thank our friends at Wise Markets as well. Talk about local businesses sticking with us. I had Rob Santoni on last week, and we'll be talking to a lot of managers and people. And, as much as I talked about the chicken at Rofo the other day, I get the produce at Wise. I've been getting the cucumbers and the lettuce and the tomatoes and the dressings, the stuff that I eat, berries, which are on sale this week, by the way. So a big shout out to Wise. I'm going to be telling everybody about Fantastic Fridays and eating better and spending less. That's Wise. And we call these intelligent conversations, but I call them wise conversations. This is where we're going to veer off track. Luke Jones joins us now. Once, maybe twice, sometimes if it involves DDP yoga, we do 3 wrestling segments a year here. This is actually going to be a football segment, I think. But Luke, it was extra special this weekend. And I don't know if you had been a golf person as well. I'm not a golf person. Turns out my cat, free plug for the Baltimore Humane Society, my cat loves the sounds of the birds at Augusta when I have it on Dolby Stereo left over from some Zeppelin show I was watching over the weekend. But what a weekend. And when did WrestleMania move to after Easter in the middle of April? I don't know anything about this, but I do know Bianca Belair was lovely to us, and she's the champion. And I woke up in the middle of the night, Saturday night, and I saw that before I see any of this UFC trash.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, WrestleMania, maybe it was a week later than it normally is. Normally you kind of think of first Sunday in April, although it varies. I mean, sometimes they've had it at the end of March, but the big difference, and they started this last year out of, I don't even know if it was necessity as much as trying to get 2 nights out of it, because they're running WrestleMania from their performance center in front of nobody. I mean, literally no one in the building other than the performers, a few camera tech types, and your broadcast.
A little different
crew.
Than you and your brother trying to get to New Jersey and give him $500 to sit on the roof of a stadium, right?
Yeah. Right. So what they did, they had it at Tampa, Raymond James Stadium, of course, which just hosted the Super Bowl, a house that Tom Brady rebuilt, I guess. But they had 2 nights of WrestleMania. They had crowds right around 25, I think they announced. So I don't know if it's a little more than that, a little less than that, but a very exciting time for a wrestling fan when you consider WWE had not run a show in front of fans since early March of 2020, right before the world shut down. So a really exciting time. And I, full disclosure, did not get a chance to watch Saturday night. I was at the ballpark, and I was following on Twitter and caught some replays and highlights and things of that nature, but did get a chance to watch Sunday night. And it just reminded me, as a pro wrestling fan, and as you mentioned, you and I talk about it a little bit, but as you know, I'm quite a big pro wrestling fan, have been my whole life.
You and Dennis Palazzo, shout out to Coons Fork, because Dennis loves wrestling.
I've loved pro wrestling as long as I've loved baseball. I mean, those were my 2 loves as a kid who grew up in Baltimore in the late 80s who didn't have a football team. Those were the 2 things I was passionate about as a little kid.
Bruno and Brooks. You know what I mean?
Yes.
75, 76.
So from that standpoint, seeing a big show being run in front of a big crowd, not a normal WrestleMania crowd, of course, we're not there yet, but it was fun and it was a good show.
How many people were there?
For what they announced, right around 25 each night. So that's about what the Super Bowl ran. When you think of Raymond James, and keep in mind you have the actual field itself that you can house more people there. So I think it was it as socially distanced as you'd like? I mean, that's in the eye of the beholder,
when they
I
won
suppose.
The Super Bowl, we saw that nobody was socially distanced.
Sure. So, right. So, but that said, that acknowledgement aside, it was great to see a live wrestling show again. As I've said to you, I've had so much respect for what WWE has tried to do. AEW has run their shows since August out of Daly's Place, which is kind of an amphitheater that's adjacent to the Jaguars Stadium. Of course, the Khan family owns AEW. They've had a very limited socially distanced crowd going back to August. I mean, you're talking a few hundred people in an amphitheater that's that holds probably a few thousand. So it's been a bare bones live audience for them. It's been fun.
What a crazy
but
time
I
for
think
wrestling too,
just like any other walk of life.
There is for the first time the TNT sort of startup that you've mentioned that Alex Marvez is a part of and we've talked about.
Yeah,
it's off my radar a little bit, right? I mean, it shows up on my Twitter sometimes and Bianca Belair. And I'll say this, I saw video and the bumps that these ladies take and Bianca Belair's 8-pack abs, 12-pack, whatever the hell that is, right? And she was great. She came on and did a term with us on charity, and you can go check that out and Google it at Baltimore Positive. I just wonder if I had tuned in, right? Like if I put it on, would I stay with it, the storylines and how it presents to someone new, right? I mean, is it like the Super Bowl where they sort of make it to hook somebody like me in, or no?
Sure. Yeah, I'd say that's fair. I mean, they didn't have it this year, but typically they'll have a couple. They've had Goldberg wrestle some big matches at WrestleMania in recent years. I mean, years ago, almost 9 years ago now, John Cena against The Rock. I mean, that was billed as present versus past, or future versus present, whatever.
The other night,
so they
wrestling, right?
She was not, but she's a big deal. But it speaks to the depth of their roster at this point. I mean, WWE, my brother and I joke about it. They collect talent at this point, and AEW has helped in that way. I don't think WWE necessarily views AEW as a threat just yet. They're doing well, but WWE became the NFL, so to speak. I mean, I don't need to tell you what wrestling was years and years ago with the territory system and even the Monday Night Wars in the 90s. I mean, WWE had a monopoly for 20 years. I mean, as much as you love Ring of Honor locally, and
I did this with Dennis. I've spent a couple of hours with wrestling the last couple months. Did I tell you I watched the Fabulous Moolah piece? Did we talk about this?
What, the Dark Side of the Ring series?
My wife taped those
it's great.
for me. And
it's fantastic.
Some of them that I'm interested in. The Bruiser Brody one I haven't watched yet. Jimmy Snuka, I'm interested in that. But I watched Fabulous Moolah. My wife's like, yeah, let's watch this one night. It was 12 degrees out back in February. You and I never talked about it. It really stirred me about Cyndi Lauper and Captain Lou and where it was in 1984 and, sort of my role in it being an old Bruno, Bobo Brazil, Haystacks Calhoun, that era, mid-70s. And Kevin Eck, who is, everybody knows who Kevin Eck is if you're involved in wrestling. Kevin Eck was my best friend growing up, sort of well-documented in the 70s and going to wrestling matches and, Georgia Championship Wrestling and cable television and all of that in the early 80s. And here we are 40 years later, and you love it, your brother loves it, Dennis still loves it, Kevin still loves it. There's a huge audience that loves Kevin, that loves it, that gets together up in Harford County and loves it. And it, it collides in my life with you, right? Like when we're at the Super Bowl and, DDP wants to sit down and talk about yoga and talk about wrestling, or Goldberg has sat down, or The Rock a million years ago has sat down and done conversation with me. It is amazing that this year, it's never been on Master Sunday, right? I'm not wrong about that, correct?
You know what?
That seems like something I would remember.
I feel like it has been, though. I mean, this really, like I said, maybe it was pushed back a weekend, a week, but it's typically been early April in recent years. I mean, it really has been. But I'd like you just mentioned that, though. And look, pro wrestling, you either love it or I feel like you liked it at some point in your life. Maybe some people feel differently, but there was always that joke: you either like wrestling or you admit to liking wrestling. I mean, there was always kind of that guilty pleasure. But you just mentioned, the generational connections, and I mean, AEW right now, Tully Blanchard manages a tag team. You have Sting, who's kind of sort of the mentor for another young star on AEW.
Sting, who, by the way, I drank with at Hammerjack. So
That's funny. Have a go with that. Yeah, Stinger's in his 60s now, and actually just wrestled a tag team kind of cinematic match. They've done that for some of these older guys to kind of protect them, and it looks better then, rather than seeing a 60-year-old guy taking live bumps and everything. But no, to bring it back to WrestleMania, I mean, seeing it in front of a live crowd, and I mentioned throughout the pandemic, I've mentioned this when trying to draw the parallels of baseball being played in an empty ballpark, football being run in an empty stadium. If pro wrestling, knowing that that is such a crowd dependent forum. I mean, the whole gist of it is having a good guy and a bad guy. One guy getting cheered as the baby face, and the heel is the guy that people are booing and throwing trash at and everything. So if pro wrestling was able to function and survive during this last year, that's why I said all along, I think the other sports can still be enjoyable. Weird as it might be, I think you can still take some enjoyment out of it. But that said, having an opportunity to see it in front of a live crowd, a substantial live crowd over the weekend, it was fun. And again, it's another little, in the same way that you're starting to see some live music at outdoor bars and things of that nature now, we're slowly but surely ramping back up to getting back into those things that so many of us love, whether it's wrestling, whether it's concerts, whether it's going to a ball game, whether it's the Ravens potentially hosting 71,000 for games in the fall. It's exciting, and it was fun to see over the weekend. And it wasn't the best WrestleMania ever, but it certainly had some memorable moments. You mentioned Bianca Belair, who we had a chance to chat with. She wins the women's title on Saturday night, which was the main event for night one. And then night two was Roman Reigns defending the Universal title against Daniel Bryan and Edge, who started way back in the Attitude Era, had actually retired 10 years ago because of concerns about his neck, and all these years later started to train again. He got cleared. That whatever the neck issue was, doctors had a certain comfort level to say, yeah, you can do this if you're smart about it and you train and work. So you kind of had some different generations clashing there in that main event. And Roman Reigns goes over. He's the big star of WWE right now. He's the guy that for years they wanted to make the next Rock, the next John Cena, and fans really pushed back on it big time. So what did they do over the last year? They turned him heel, and he's been unbelievable. He's put some of the best character work I've seen in pro wrestling in a long time, and he truly is now the big star that WWE wanted. He's a bad guy.
I'm sure Hogan, baby.
Yeah, I'm sure they'll turn him. The same thing happened with The Rock way back when.
Oh, that's how Ric Flair. That was the beauty of Ric Flair. He wasn't good or bad. He was whatever you want him to be.
But the fans dictate who the stars are going to be. And way back in 1996, The Rock is Rocky Maivia. They hail him as this third generation superstar, grandfather of High Chief Peter Maivia and Rocky Johnson. The fans hated him. So what did they do? They turned him heel. He became The Rock, and he became one of the greatest superstars in professional wrestling history. So Roman Reigns kind of having a, not exactly the same, but kind of a similar rejection from the fans as being the top baby face. So you turn him heel, and he's done some outstanding work, and it was a great triple threat main event on Sunday night. And the fans didn't go home happy because he retained the title, but from a storyline standpoint, it was a great show and a fun night. And just a reminder of how much we've missed that as wrestling fans, seeing, whether you're going to a show or just watching a live audience on TV, it certainly makes a difference.
He is no Thunder Lips. I promise you that. All of our WNST, I promised our friends at Wise Markets we'd have intelligent conversations here. I don't know how this thing meandered into professional wrestling, but that was an intelligent conversation about professional wrestling, a wise conversation at least. Anyway, I could read the bananas read here now, and that may be even funny. Go bananas over low prices. I actually have some bananas. They're delicious. All right, so let's talk football here. Let's go bananas on football. Draft a little ways out. We're going to get a schedule. I would say imminent, soon, very soon, right? I mean, we'll know when we're going, who and where and why and all of that. I've had some great conversations. As much as I've had Michael Steele on and Senator Charles Sidnor on, and I've mixed things up with Rob Santoni, we've had those kind of conversations. I had Mike Silver on this week talking about the draft and talking about whether Sammy Watkins can help the Ravens. I've had Adam Teicher on from ESPN out in Kansas City, who watched Sammy Watkins try to do it out there for 3 years when they went to Super Bowls. The wide receiver thing, that's the real question here until they get productivity there. And again, I keep going back to that. How much do they really want to pass the football? And I'll leave it at that. And you'll tell me there'll be some arc of something that would lead them to 3 victories in January and a Super Bowl victory that would look like efficiency without productivity in the way of Lamar being 38 of 51 for 496 yards, because that's not the way it's ever going to look, ever. Not on a sunny day, not on a dreary day.
No, I mean, it's not. And I mean, there are other, I think we can get into some other aspects of the team like edge rusher, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But it's about finding efficiency. And we talked about this. I mean, 2 years ago, they were much more efficient throwing the football than they were last year. And we saw a difference there. Now, 2 years ago, did that mean that they were ultimately ready to throw the ball at a level that they needed to get to the Super Bowl? Well, the Tennessee Titans said no. You know, they got their answer then. Although, keep in mind, they turned the ball over. They couldn't stop the run. There were other elements that worked against them that night against the Titans 2 Januaries ago. But this narrative about the passing game, you know, whether it's a narrative, whether you think it's completely true, whether elements of it are true, which is what I think. You know, I don't think it's just wide receiver. I think it's a number of things that they have to improve upon, from, you know, the coaching to Lamar Jackson continuing to improve, and, you know, the pass protection, which they add Kevin Zeitler. But all of these questions are going to remain until they're not questions anymore, right? I mean, you're deep enough into this now that what they do in September doesn't matter. What they do in November and December doesn't matter. It comes back to January. And that's not to discredit what they've done. They've won 25 football games over the last 2 years. They've been right there with anyone not named the Kansas City Chiefs, or I guess, you know, this past year, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. But they've been right there, and they played at a really high level. So the problem with that,
and the management of money this time of year that gets them there. I mean, it really is. There's a deep wisdom that they're really good at this, which is why they're always playing games in late December, which is why it's kind of like super hard for me, even though I do this professionally, to second guess them at some point or in some way. But I think the wide receiver debate opens the can for all that you talk about edge rusher. I would argue center. I would argue that they need the best center that they can find. Maybe not the best in the league. They have the best kicker on earth, right? I mean, they've had a great punter. Mm-hmm. Center would be something that I'd like to see a center married to Lamar, as much as I'd like to see Hollywood Brown married to Lamar, for me, over the next 3-4 years.
Yeah, and that's fair. You know, and as I've said, I mean, this organization deserves great praise. They deserve so much credit, and they get that. Well, let's be very clear about this. When fans are talking about being unhappy in January, that's the case anywhere when you lose in the playoffs. I mean, no one's sitting there just saying, "Oh, we're happy just getting to the divisional round every year." Because when you get to the divisional round every year, what happens? You want more then, and that's part of being a fan. As long as that's grounded in some reality that you're not expecting to win the Super Bowl every single year. You want your fans to want to win the Super Bowl every single year.
Dude,
I think most Ravens fans
spent half our day talking about the Orioles. I'm looking over your shoulder at the bird, and I'm like,
sure.
It's incredible. You know, the pendulum we swing on from 10 days of Oriole baseball, we move to football, and what becomes necessary for the football team to do, and how it's a conversation that supersedes anything the baseball team's doing right now.
Yeah, and part of that's the NFL's king in general. I mean, I think you'd probably find some other markets where even their baseball team is better than the Orioles, and people are talking about the draft, and that's the NFL, and that's why it's king. And it's just the truth. I love baseball, but I fully acknowledge the NFL is much more popular. NFL is much more popular than just about everything out there when you look at television ratings in 2021. I mean, that's just where we are.
The wildest part is watching baseball the first 10 days. The first thing I got out of it, middle of the week, I'm like, my God, they think gambling's going to save it. You know what I mean? Like everything about baseball suddenly, after 100 years of nothing and Pete Rose and holding their nose, is now like Melanie sitting underneath a gambling thing and, you know, here are the pitchers and go get them. I'm 52 years old. I don't even know how to bet on baseball. I don't know how to bet on baseball. I've never, you know where I am with the analytics. I'm trying to figure that out first.
Sure.
But football, man, betting on football, you can't bet on any of this, I guess, right? I mean, they figured out a way to bet on draft yet? I mean, that's what they should be doing. But betting on who DeCosta's going to draft. That should fire it up, you know?
You can bet on anything. I mean, you can bet on WrestleMania if you want to. I mean, but you know, I mean, you and I've talked about this. You haven't been a fantasy football guy. Everyone plays fantasy football. You're the outlier there. But it just speaks to you're trying to cast a wider net. And baseball, in that sense, it's good they're trying to do it. To your point, I don't know if it's going to quote save it. Although I'm not nearly as fatalistic about where baseball is right now as you. I mean, I think they need to certainly improve things, but that said, you know, kind of coming back to the NFL, the Ravens, there is a lot of excitement, and yeah, they're at a different standard than the Orioles right now because they've been successful for 25 years or 20 years, let's say, and the Orioles have been successful for about 3 or 4 of those years. So, you know, you do the math there. It's not hard to figure out, and it's a credit to the Ravens, and it's not a credit to the Orioles. So, but yeah, there's a lot of excitement with the draft, and you know, as much as we focused on wide receiver, and those questions are going to linger. You know, and you know, they can come out of this draft with, you know, having drafted Rashad Bateman or Terrace Marshall or whoever at the end of the first round at the wide receiver position. I think for now with Sammy Watkins, and you know me, I did not do cartwheels about that. I'm not going to do cartwheels about it. At the same time, I'm not going to sit here and say it's a terrible move either. We'll see. He's a guy who's really talented when he's healthy.
Something, you know what I mean? Like,
well, I don't want
him to do something.
Well, and I don't want that. If they don't draft a wide receiver in the first 2-3 rounds, then I'll be concerned, and I'm not going to shy away from that because I've been consistent on that. I was banging the table for wide receivers when Joe Flacco was the Ravens quarterback. So why would I not do the same for Lamar Jackson?
He's also banging for cornerbacks too.
Sure.
I'm banging for a center, right?
Of course.
If they get a center in the 4th round that they love, great. You know what I mean? And he plays great. I mean, if that's where they are, but.
Sure, but you mentioned center. I mean, I think it's going to be interesting. I mean, you know that over the last year or two, there's been chatter of moving Bradley Bozeman to center. Do you move him to center? Do you give him a contract extension as he's entering a free agent year? And then look at Ben Powers, Ben Bredesen, Tyree Phillips, that group of guys to battle it out at left guard. You know, Kevin Zeitler's your right guard now. He's not Marshall Yanda, but certainly a market upgrade over anything they trotted out there at right guard last year. So, you know, I think the center question is a good one. I think it is a lot to expect to draft a center at this point, and he's going to come in and start from day one. That's why I think the Bozeman option is interesting there. But I think your point is well taken. We've talked about this with Matt Burke. Go back to Jeff Mitchell and then your pal Mike Flynn for years. I mean, you want to have stability at that position, and frankly, the Ravens haven't had a ton of that in recent years since Matt Burke retired. I mean, think about it: Gino Gradkowski and Jeremy Zuda, and John Urschel for a second, and Ryan Jensen, who parlayed it into becoming the highest paid center in the NFL after 1 year of starting. So you go down and then Matt Skura comes in and did a respectable job. I mean, this was a rookie free agent who was on the practice squad. He didn't even make the 53-man roster his first 2 years coming out of preseason, and he ended up being a solid 3-4 year starter for you. I mean, that's a win. But that said, you want to try to get better there, and that's where they are right now. So I think the Bozeman option is really interesting, and we'll see how the draft shakes out. And you never know, could there be a veteran center that becomes available via trade
to touch the ball 8-12 times a game, and a center that's touching the ball 60 times in the pivot spot in the offense? I'm no analytics guy, but I would say better take care of that first. And especially when we saw bad things. And I'm not even about bad things happening and wet balls and Skura's hand and slipping in the ball. I'm not even talking about that. I'm just in a general sense of how plays are designed and how offenses work and who the smartest people on the field need to be organized and calling out defenses. Teams that have a great center win. That's all I'll say.
That's fair. I don't think it's an either or. I think it's a proposition where you need to address both, and we'll see how it ultimately plays out. If Sammy Watkins is the only answer kind of in that pairing of positions, and they just decide to move Bradley Bozeman over to center. I think Bozeman played center at Alabama for he was a multi-year starter there.
It's not like do it. Then why wasn't he playing all along with the problems they had to some degree?
Sure. But again, let's also not throw Matt Skura under the bus entirely. I mean, he was playing at a pretty high level before he tore up his knee in November of 2019. So
I mean, I was there from the roof watching him in LA. It was an incredible, tragedy for his career. And I think we've seen, a number of guys that were never the same after something like that when they get carved off.
Sure. And I mean, we'll see how he does in Miami. And, I wish him well. But yeah, I mean, the Ravens want to try to get better
this generation, my favorite Raven since Flacco left the team by far.
Yeah. I mean, he's certainly, a guy who, from everything we've gotten to, how we've gotten to know him on a very limited basis, good guy who worked hard, and a guy who's well liked in the organization. But you get to a point where something has run its course, and you either want to get younger or you want to get better at a position, and that's where the Ravens kind of are right now. I was
a Ryan Jensen guy until it was how much?
Exactly. I mean that's always the way this works. I mean you're always chasing that, and you always know you're going to lose players. I mean, and this is probably a good segue into the edge defender position. You and I've talked so much about wide receiver or the offensive line. I mean, what's edge defender going to look like? I mean, they re-signed Tyus Bowser. Okay, that's great. He steps up. He's going to start presumably in Matt Judon's old spot as the starting Sam rather than the backup Sam. But okay, he was already a pretty big part of their rotation. And Yannick Ngakwe's gone now, and Jihad Ward's gone now. And Pernell McPhee's back, but he's another year older, and he was already on a pitch count. So as much as we've talked about wide receiver and the offensive line, and understandably so, I think you look at the edge defender position, outside linebacker, pass rushers, that's still a big question mark. And I think what's interesting, and this brings us to some news late last week. Justin Houston, of course, a longtime veteran pass rusher, going to come in and visit this week. But the Ravens are in a position, having lost Judon, having lost Ngakwe, they have comp picks that are sitting there, presumably fourth round picks. We'll see where the cutoff line is, third, whether it's the third or fourth, but they have attractive comp picks there. So if you're Eric DaCosta, this is where you are weighing, looking at some of these veteran unrestricted free agents that are still out on the market, acknowledging that you need help at that position, but does signing Justin Houston before the early May cutoff, where you get to the point where these unrestricted free agents don't count against the comp pick formula. I think is it May 5th, May 4th, off the top of my head. I don't have it in front of me, but you kind of weigh that gamble of hoping, whether it's him, whether it's Melvin Ingram, whether it's Jadeveon Clowney, any of these guys that are still out there that conceivably can help your pass rush, but there's a reason they're still out there and they weren't signed in the way that Matt Judon and Ngakwe went off the board the first day. But you kind of weigh wanting to wait this out to preserve those comp picks that are going to help you in the future. And that's how you keep this pipeline of talent going, especially when you're starting to pay your big stars, starting with your quarterback. But that's where you kind of play this gamble where, yeah, they're going to meet with Justin Houston, but I'm guessing they're not going to sign him right away. Because they want to try to protect those comp picks. I mean, they have cap space. I think NFLPA's latest kind of daily report, I think, had them in the $13 million cap space range. So they have money and they could create more space if they wanted to. But you get to that point where how much are you really gaining? Justin Houston's a great example. I mean, you're talking about a guy who had 8 sacks last year. Hey, that would help them. I mean, he would have been right there with their team leader. With 8 sacks a year ago, but he's 32 years old. His quarterback hits declined last year. His pressure rate declined last year. Pro Football Focus did not have him graded in all that terribly high. And that's not the end all be all, but it's information for you. So the question is, yeah, Justin Houston in the right fit in terms of how many plays he's playing and how he fits in the scheme, he can help them. I think he really can. And I think that would be a good signing. But is that a good signing, meaning you have to give up a 4th round comp pick? Because in the formula, you're going to lose one of those 2 comp picks if you sign him before early May. Or do you wait and gamble, even if he ends up signing elsewhere, but you hope one of those other guys are there? you gamble, you wait a couple more weeks, you see how the draft plays out. There are edge rushers in the draft that, they could ultimately sign or draft, select, and then decide maybe you don't need to sign Justin Houston then. But, this is all part of the algebra, the calculus of the offseason as far as trying to weigh getting better now with wanting to keep yourself in a good position for the future. And we know the Ravens value comp picks, and that doesn't mean you should never sign a free agent. But Justin Houston's not the guy he was 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. I think he can still help. I think he's someone that could fit, and maybe you pair him up with Pernell McPhee in like almost a platoon kind of situation. But do you love him enough? Are you confident that he's moving the meter enough to forego one of those 4th-round comp picks you're in line to receive? That's where I think the Ravens kind of look at this and say, let's bring him in. We're going to talk. Maybe we have a little wink, wink, under the table handshake agreement to wait until after the draft. And, you run the risk because some team could come calling him, or he runs the risk of knowing the Ravens could draft an edge rusher in the 1st round, and maybe they change their minds. But
kind of I
think that's where the Ravens kind of are at that position. But they click. Yeah, but that's where you're kind of weighing this right now. They clearly need more bodies at outside linebacker. I think we can all agree with that. You can't go into a season with Tyus Bowser, Jalen Ferguson, and Pernell McPhee, and then your practice squad guys. That's a recipe for big problems. So they clearly have to bring in a couple guys. So I'm guessing it's going to be one of those veterans that I mentioned, and Houston's the next guy that's visiting. So we'll see how that goes and what happens over the next couple weeks with that. But they're going to need they need a couple bodies, but they also need guys who can come in and do a good job for them. I think after 3 years now into the Wink Martindale era, he can scheme pressure. It doesn't mean they're going to have a great pass rush. It doesn't mean they're going to lead the league in sacks. But as much as there's been hand wringing about the pass rush, that hasn't been what's really cost them games. Other than if you want to say Kansas City, fine. But I'd say the Ravens didn't score enough points against Kansas City either. So you come back to that side of the discussion. But they're going to continue to scheme pressure and play games with their defensive linemen up front with stunts and twists and different things of that nature. But you still need a couple more guys to execute that. And Justin Houston feels like the kind of guy that would make sense in that way. But he's 32. Again, the 8 sacks probably aren't a great indicator of what his season actually was when you look at how his quarterback hits dropped and he wasn't pressuring at the same rate as some previous years. But if he's a post-draft signing where you pass that deadline and you don't lose a comp pick, yeah, bring him in. That sounds like a great short-term kind of fix. But at the same time, you're hoping that I know the Penn State kid Jason Owa and some other guys that have been linked to the Ravens 1st, 2nd round. These aren't stud Myles Garrett kind of pass rushers you're going to plug and play and they're going to get 15 sacks, but guys that I think would be interesting early in the draft. We'll see if the Ravens land one of those guys, but I think it's very clear, as much as we've talked about wide receiver in the passing game and the offensive line, and we'll continue to talk about those things because it's been a big part of the narrative of where the Ravens have fallen short the last couple of years. The pass rush is still a big area they need to address, and I think they will address, but might just be a couple more weeks until we see them bring in one of these veteran guys, and ultimately we'll see how it falls with the draft as far as how much urgency they have to do that.
NFL is on the docket all month long as we get ready for the draft. We'll be talking more with some NFL folks. If you missed my conversation with Mike Silver, you can go find that out in the podcast audio vault, as well as our conversation with Adam Teicher about all things Sammy Watkins. Luke can be found, Baltimore Luke, anywhere the internet serves you, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, also down at Oriole Park at Camden Yards, watching the birds try to fly here into April. We'll be waiting on an NFL schedule here soon as well. Be getting that out, of course, first on the WNST text service, all brought to you by Coons Ford, Security Boulevard. Dennis Colatzos is here on Thursday and again on Sunday. Luke joins him. I join him. And when there's breaking news, you get it first on the WNST text service. As always, I think we're like 14 years into that now. It's 15 years. 06. Wow. All right. Have at it. You can find me, Nasty, at WNST.net. Everywhere out on the internet and doing all sorts of things about music and sports and entertainment and the world opening back up and some good food stuff, doing a crab cake tour, talking some golf as well this week. So Got it all in one place. We are WNST.net, AM 1570, Towson, Baltimore. We never stop talking Baltimore positive.